Okay, so we started with Mohammed Al-Gharabi kind of south of the lake, and we've moved eastward to Dearborn, and we're going to continue our journey now to right downtown Detroit. Would you help get her presentation set up, please? Heather Carmona joined M1 Rail 2 or 3 months ago, 4 months ago already. She spent about 15 years with the Woodward Avenue Action Association, which is a nonprofit that helps foster economic development along the Woodward Avenue corridor, starting in Detroit and going on and on. I guess I don't know where it ultimately goes, but it just keeps going out of Detroit. And Pontiac. Okay. So, with no further ado, Heather Carmona.
You're 10 and 10. So the other 10. Thank you very much. I did want to thank, as we walked out the door, my colleagues Tim Hepner and Tim Fisher for inviting us to be part of this presentation. I also want to thank Mayor O'Reilly for a great segue. I think the biggest thing that in our office and for the last few months we've been saying is transit has to start somewhere, and I think M1 is the best example of that in Southeast Michigan right now. So thank you for that, because that's I think what we feel as well. I'm sure there's some background here, and I know we have a limited amount of time. I did want to start by telling where the system is today. There's been an evolution with M1 Rail. Some of you may know that, some of you may not. So I'm going to try to do a little bit of a hybrid in my presentation, give some background, not too much of that background, but move to where we are. And if there are questions specifically, I'd be happy to answer those. I just want to be able to get through and not get too hung up in the weeds. So if there's things that I haven't addressed or overlooked in logic of what you know about M1 Rail, please let me know. But I'll just move through my presentation. I also realize that it looks like I'm intended to be here tomorrow, not today, when I sent my presentation on my date. So, okay, so what and who? I always like to say who because there are people behind M1 Rail. We are a 501c3 nonprofit corporation that was formed a couple of years ago, so we are a formal entity. What M1 Rail is I also like to highlight it's a streetcar. I'll talk a little bit about how the rail came into our name, but we are a streetcar system that is connecting downtown Detroit, beginning at the river up through the new center, or what we like to call the North End neighborhood, along what we consider to be obviously the region's most dynamic corridor, which is Woodward Avenue. It's an unprecedented combination of public and private investment. I'll talk a little bit about that. It's a circulator. Again, these key buzzwords in the transit industry never made a difference. Now I do a circulator and a key connector to the Amtrak station, which we heard a lot about today. It's a catalyst to expand regional connections and mobility, a critical step in the creation of a multimodal modern transit system. And ultimately, upon its development and operations, it will become what we hope to be, what we're calling an anticipated asset of the newly formed regional transit system, and become part, if not connecting to the proposed bus rapid transit system on Woodward, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. So some fast facts, again, along the route. For those who are not familiar with Woodward Avenue, it is linear, it's straight, there's a little bit of an angle, but basically it's a linear system. It's 3.3-mile modern fixed-track streetcar. If you're Dan Gilbert, who is one of our principals of the system, he likes to say it's 6.6. I think he likes to maximize the number and say, well, you're actually running 6.6 miles of track, not 3.3, which is a really good point. But I think logic has, if you're going from point A to point B and back, point one end of the line to the other, it's 3.3. So we use 3.3. We let Dan use 6.6 if it makes his numbers better. Again, running from Larned Street, which is just the block north of the Detroit River downtown, up to Graham Boulevard. There are 11 stops, or again, Dan's logic is 22 stops along the corridor. Curb running. We will actually start in the center downtown. If you traverse Campus Martius, which is right downtown, we go to curb running, stay curb running, and then we will move over to center running before you hit the Amtrak viaduct. So we kind of start like this. As I mentioned, designed to provide links to key destinations along the corridor, which we'll talk about. Our service, what we anticipate to be our service, I think we're saying about 12 to 15, or 10 to 12, and off-peak. Our capital costs are about $129 million, and the perfect timing for Tim to come in right as we've talked this back and forth at various board meetings about capital costs on our project. But roughly around $129 million, about $5 million in annual operating costs, and that does not include the rebuild that's happening right now. The project does include the rebuild that MDOT agreed to do or had proposed to do concurrent to the M1 construction that will be from Sidley, and you can see on the map there, up to the northern part of the line. So the idea was to build, as talked a little bit in the prior presentation about doing some of that infrastructure improvement while the line is going in. It makes a lot of sense. It creates a lot of challenges as well. But we're looking right now at ways in which we can maximize the investments and the improvements in that area, and a lot of things happening in that area too. As I said before, we are a streetcar. I think a lot of confusion early on, just a little bit of background, not to go into too much, but when M1 Rail was originally conceived, it was part of an ongoing process for the city of Detroit was involved in to do a light rail system on Woodward from the river from the city's boundary up to 8 Mile Road. It became apparent in about 2009 or 10 that the city was not able to proceed with that project, and that was when the governor came in and said, we have a plan in place that the Regional Coordinating Council did a few years back. We need to look at how we're going to implement and reenact this plan that the 4 counties, I think Washtenaw was involved in that plan at the time. I look at Tim as if he's fully Washtenaw County, but Wayne, Oakland, Macomb, I believe Washtenaw. How do we move that forward, and what components of that can we move forward? So it was at that time that the private sector investors, led by Roger Penske and Dan Gilbert and Peter Carmona and Mike Illich, came together and said, well, we would like to advance, how could we help advance that plan? And very simply, they said we'd be willing to fund or look at ways that we could advance that. And very quickly, I think they learned, they're obviously savvy businessmen, that once you become part of any process that would involve, they heard very early on, knowing that with the work that had been done on the environmental impact on the Woodward Light Rail, and the Environmental Council was involved in a lot of that, anytime you involve the federal funds, becomes a federalized process. So very quickly they realized that it wasn't going to move ahead at the speed that I think they wanted it to, but they stuck it out and were able to raise the funds to move forward, and again, use it as a piece, as Jack was saying, the catalyst of hopefully a larger system to move forward. So a little sidebar there, but basically, again, we are a streetcar system. The M1 rail name was incorporated. We were going through the rail process, so it just kind of stuck, I should say. But we will have a modern streetcar, so we are a circulator with all of the advantages and amenities that you see here with a modern streetcar. I mentioned the funding support. I realized my slides off by $1 million. We're saying $129, $130 million total capital costs. This is a list of our stakeholder support. State of Michigan, when you stepped out, and I thank you, is our largest partner here, along with the FTA and the Federal Highway Administration. A lot of nuances working with the Federal Highway and FDA together. We learn a lot about those two agencies and their interactions, or non-interactions, I should say. And then also having the private sector involvement has been very interesting too. So we like to say in the office that this is an unprecedented project, but a lot of what's happened is a lot of these folks have never interacted with one another. So a lot of what we're doing in terms of contracts, agreements have never been done before. So it's everybody kind of pointing to someone else. Well, how do you do? I'm not sure. How do you do that? Which makes it very intriguing, very interesting, challenging, and ultimately. It's very challenging, but hopefully very rewarding. So again, this is a list of our funders, many of which who are actually funding a station. So the original plan was to look at how do we fund stations, and in essence have these donors sponsor stations along the route. So as you can see, they're major corporations, destinations, the healthcare people have an interest in this stake and what happens in supporting the health and the vitality of the corridor. Our board of directors, a little bit again, the who's behind this. We do have an active board. Mr. Hefner serves on our board. Great guidance. Our partners are City of Detroit, MDOT, FTA, Federal Highway, the Detroit Economic Growth Corporation, SEMCOG, Midtown Detroit, and the Detroit Downtown Detroit Partnership, who are two very active business groups that are within the line area. You can see the rest of our staff, finance, fundraising, a very unique delivery system. I won't get into this at length, but I learned something that I really didn't know was how the system is being delivered. We're doing it under a design-build formula, so we have some autonomy in certain areas, and we're able to procure and implement the different packages, whether it's vehicle procurement, the vehicle maintenance facility, the actual design, and then the construction and operating the system all as individual components. So in that way, it helps costs, helps us evaluate, helps us determine our pricing a little bit better, and gives us a really true estimation of what the system would cost. Ultimately, our goal, again, is a safe, convenient transportation for residents, visitors, employers, and employees. Provide access and mobility to enhance the existing retail, restaurant business in various destinations, increase property values, regional density, everything you know about transit, support investment in TOD, and then linkages across the region. Some of the preliminary transit-oriented development work that was done a couple of years ago determined that just in the rail line, the 3.3 miles itself, there's the potential for access right now. And this was done a couple of years ago, so my thought is that these numbers have increased. We haven't really assessed them. It is access to about 125,000 jobs, and in the radius around, and I forgot the exact, exact radius of the study area, is 275,000 residents, which is roughly about a quarter of the population of the city as a whole right now. Estimated about $500 to $1 billion in economic development. And our numbers on ridership, I think are very conservative because the FTA challenged us a lot on this, but the estimation of ridership is about 5,000 to 8,000 per day. That may seem very low, but if you think about the amount of investment that's occurred downtown, Quicken Loans, for example, Dan Gilbert, in just the last 2 years has brought 10,000 jobs to the city of Detroit. So, you even look at if just a fraction of his employees rode the system, we'd be almost touching our anticipated numbers or exceeding them. And this is just a little slide that gives a little bit of an example of some of the investment and things that's happening in the area to support the system. And to Mayor O'Reilly's comment, if you start somewhere, these are the supporting elements that we believe will make it really succeed. So again, from Quicken, a strategy that the Midtown Detroit has going right now to encourage working with Henry Ford folks, if you're working at a healthcare institution or Wayne State, to actually live downtown. The storefronts is an engaged strategy right now to bring 200 new storefronts downtown. The whole, Eds and Meds, the tech economy, the boom that's happening right downtown with Tech Town, that expansion and growth. And again, this is the ridership projections that we're hoping for. So these are some other numbers that really populate and I think add a lot of credibility to our business case as to why we feel M1 will succeed. It's the employer base, again, the residents, the students, the universities, major medical, visitors, hotel rooms, COBO expansion, world-class sports and entertainment, the density of everything that's happening in those nodes all up and down the corridor. Oops, I think my slide's a little bumped off here. This slide is to really just convey the station stops and it's the core destinations that are situated among all of the stops. So again, if you look at the north end, the hospitals, connecting to the Amtrak station at the north end, all the way down to the south, and I think my slide got a little off balance there. Probably the most important piece is making sure that this does connect to something, because the biggest thing we hear is, well, it's just 3.3 miles. It's nothing. It was supposed to be more. It's not going to do a whole lot if it's just 3.3 miles. So, the importance right now is that we are looking at how this is not just an independent piece of transit, but how it does connect and support things that are already either planned or existing on the corridor or are planned for. So we hear, the people mover is one. Dan Harris asked a question just about the overhead system. How are we going to interact with some of the stations for the Detroit People Mover? Those are all things the technical folks are looking at to make sure, again, that we're not going to detract or deter from what's happening in other transit areas, but we can coexist. Downtown parking shuttles, we're in conversations with partners about if they have campuses. Henry Ford, for example, has so many campuses that are off Woodward. If they shuttle people where they're parking, how they can shuttle people to actually use the transit line, or vice versa. If they're coming down Woodward Avenue and they're making a connection from SMART or another system, then how are they going to get to their work if it's, to the actual headquarters if it's a few blocks away? The DDOT bus service, that's a big important issue right now. Is you have the existing bus system on Woodward, which is devastatedly underfunded. A lot of perception that M1 Rail is pulling away from that system, completely different funding. We've been meeting with DDOT. They're under a private management company now to ensure that service at least stays, if not, it gets better, but at least stays at the levels that it's operating now, and how M1 can help support that. Local bike share programs, it's another thing that's happening. We talked about non-motorized transportation, complete streets. All of that is happening. Wayne State has been a dynamic leader in looking at bike sharing programs. Quicken has one, too. If you travel downtown now, you'll see little spots where you can hop on a bike, ride it somewhere, and then you can just leave it at another station. And that's something like the Next Ride service that we've seen in other cities. So things like that we're looking at. The commuter system, making sure, again, that there's some adjacencies to SMART. We have a Windsor Tunnel Bus, high-speed rail that was talked a lot about here. I think that's the biggest piece to the northern end, is when you get to the northern end, it just stops. Looking at the connectivity further north on Woodward, but more importantly, to the west, and ensuring that we can enable, and there's that connection to what's happening at that station. And I mentioned a little bit the expandable, the bus rapid transit system. That's underway right now. There is a transit alternative analysis, and I think Mohammed really went for showing that slide, because I never really knew how to explain an alternative analysis. We are part of that process to look at further north up to Pontiac, because there's 9 other communities up through Oakland County that people don't realize that are looking for connectivity too. And so in that way we can have Woodward Avenue be traversed as one transit corridor and hopefully as fluid as possible. Just quickly, our timeline for those of you who live and work and are in the area and want to know kind of what's happening. I like to tell people that our construction process is underway. I know, Tim, we've all been very sensitive to our, what we call, and somebody else had mentioned groundbreaking and all the, timing on that. We are in a lot of the preliminary construction right now. So we call that mobilization or pre-construction. What this will entail, essentially M1 is going to be built in 2 segments. Segment 1 and Segment 2. It enables and allows us to move forward very efficiently with the least amount of disruption to traffic and residents. So what that means is Segment 1, which is underway right now, will be a full closure in the downtown area, all travel lanes between Adams and Larned. So basically, that's going to really affect a lot of the pedestrian traffic as well, and the employees that work downtown. So we are working with DDOT. We are working with the city. We're working to make sure that we can at least have a travel lane that will provide access, but it's not going to be intended for day-to-day use. All of the detours will be signed. Our cross streets will be maintained, except when there's active work in the intersection. So the idea is to have the closure when the actual rail goes in, but that we won't disrupt some of the perpendicular traffic. We expect to be complete with Segment 1, if not 70% close to by the end of this year. Segment 2 will start next year. All of the preliminary work will go in, the vertical work on the stations that next year, and then we'll come back and actually put the stations and the fixtures and things like that, the lighting deck in throughout 2014, with the hope that the system will be functioning in 2015, towards the end of 2015. We are moving offices right now. We are looking at offices, and we will be your neighbors, so we will be in the construction zone ourselves in the next couple of weeks. We are moving into 1426 Woodward. So this is the block that's just north of the old Hudson's building at Grand River and Woodward. So if you're in the area and you want to stop in, see our plans, ask questions, find out more, you're welcome to. Our plan is to be accessible right there, feel the pain, go through the construction with everybody else. I wanted to just go through quickly, this is my last slide here, on some of the other collaborations. I touched on them a little bit. As I mentioned, we've been having conversations with, and I think this is really an important part of M1, is that it's just not building a system. It's just not going in, building a system in 2 years, operating it for a handful of years, handing it off and saying, okay, we're done. The organization will ultimately evolve, and it will evolve through these sorts of partnerships and collaborations, and I think that's very, very important, is how are we part of the community and the transit solution versus just being a piece with a very clear mission to making sure that we're helping to move other things forward. A lot of effort downtown, again, with Mr. Wilbert and his efforts to make downtown a really true, walkable, livable place. Concepts for really engaging the public parks in a lot of ways with people and cafes and things like that. Concept for what he's calling the Woodward Esplanade is something that we're looking at, which is a pedestrian plaza that would be along Woodward Avenue. I mentioned the employee shuttles. Anybody who's a stakeholder who has any interest in moving people, economic development, jobs along Woodward, we're open to talking to them about ways logistically M1 can help connect to their employer base and their business better. A lot of discussions right now about a fiber network. We have had some meetings with Wayne State and Quicken that once we dig up Woodward Avenue, there's opportunities in a lot of ways to do some things from a technology standpoint. So our COO likes to use the phrase that once you dig up Woodward, everyone wants to jump down your hole or jump in there. But it presents great opportunities for looking at a wireless network, very extensive types of technology improvements and things like that. So we're in some of those discussions now. I mentioned the Woodward Transit Alternative Analysis. That is expected to wrap up later this year with some recommendations for the bus rapid transit that we're hoping to embrace and help move forward. There's an active Complete Streets master plan process that's underway right now in Woodward. I know Deb Alfonso's here, and she's been an advocate. I worked with Deb on this in helping move this previously. That plan is wrapping up soon. We're looking at how some of the elements of complete streets, whether it's bike lanes, pedestrian refuges, safety, things that, early on I think in the design M1 really didn't think about, but now MDOT's saying we need to think about these things, which is great. So we have a good partnership with MDOT helping to sort of embrace some of those strategies and look at how we need to be including those. There's non-motorized planning efforts happening throughout the city of Detroit. There's the Regional Transportation Authority, which was just enacted last year. I heard somebody else mention, I think, another transit authority, or you were talking about something where right, and how you were kind of held your feet to the fire a little bit. It was kind of the governor held M1's feet to the fire and said, listen, if we're going to pass this RTA, M1 better be part of this. And so that was really the linchpin in kind of moving us forward as well. The stadium redevelopment, there is an active proposal right now with the Illage organization. I think there's no secret they're building a new stadium on Woodward, which will occupy a large piece of real estate there. We've been meeting with them to make sure that the plans for our stations and access, and again, crossings all integrate into their plans. We need a lot of those things really. Business support, that's another big thing. When construction happens, we realize that will be an impact on businesses. So we have a business support program modeled after Minneapolis. When Minneapolis came in and built their street line, we brought them in to give us some good practices on what we can do to mitigate, whether it's loans, assistance like that with some of the businesses to ensure that they can be vibrant still and viable through the construction. And then another very important thing is jobs. Workforce development. How is M1 used as a pipeline for further jobs? So there will be a small percentage of jobs directly related to the construction for M1, but more importantly, with other development projects in the works, whether it's the stadium, whether it's the North American trade crossing, things like that, we want to be an enabler to ensure that those jobs are staying here and that we can be a pipeline for those. So these are all examples of some really good partnerships I think M1 is helping to facilitate in addition to just the hardcore construction of the line. So I hope I touched on enough with the background. Yeah, thank you.
So we have time for, I think, 10 minutes of questions. They've expanded this session until 2:15. So we have time now for questions about any of the three presentations. Dave, do you want to...
Do we have a question off one? Yeah. DJ Hogan wants to know when the streetcars are going to be procured for that project.
Yeah, we are in the process of developing an RFP. It's expected that, I think by October, Tim, we're saying end of September, October at the latest, we would have an RFP posted. Yep.
I'm glad to see that you have a connection from Amtrak to Windsor. Once you get to Windsor, are you working with anybody over there and getting a connection between the tunnel bus and Windsor to via rail?
You're talking about the ambulance system? You know, I'm not aware. I don't know right now. Maybe Tim, do you know a little more from those conversations?
Yeah, really, it's just the idea that Windsor Bus comes over and that they're looking at connecting to it, and the whole connection to VIA hasn't been worked out yet.
I was just going to say, I think it's interesting how you're collaborating with the private sector and the funding. Can you elaborate a little bit on how that's working? Are the stations being sponsored, or is there anything more interesting about that?
Yep, I touched a little bit. The stations are being sponsored. Just about every station has been secured by an investor, we're saying. So basically that is something that we're working to secure their support and then be sure that they are recognized appropriately within the station. So there's some nuances to that.
I think we have to take a step back on this. Initially, when this project brought forward, it was a private sector project 100%. And I think through the wisdom of the folks that have been mentioned, Heather mentioned, the Illiches, the Carmona, Roger Penske, Dan Gilbert, they saw the wisdom in making it a public-private partnership, allowing the public sector to leverage the private sector investment against future public transit or public transit investments, federal investments in Southeast Michigan, in Detroit. So.
My intent is not with this question to revisit ancient history in this, but I'm really curious why the decision was made to go with a rail project as opposed to BRT on this corridor. Other cities face that same question right now. So I'm curious what the
I'm going to let Tim address that history and the evolution of the I want to get stuck down by one of my board members.
First of all, I'm not one of your board members. I attend your board meetings, but it would be a conflict of interest for me to be a board member. It was long realized by the private sector folks that they felt they could maximize the economic opportunities if it was a fixed rail guideway as compared to a BRT.
You mentioned earlier in the presentation that you had to eventually scale back from the original plans, and it's just 3 miles. Excuse me, 6.6. But I was wondering, with the new changes to the TIFIA program at the federal level, it seems with so much private money secured already, you all would be a really excellent candidate for the TIFIA program, and that could potentially really make your dollars go a lot farther to potentially expand the line.
Yeah.
Have you guys considered that, or?
I'll let Tim. Yeah, part of the legislation that was passed was to enable that to happen, and I don't know the exact percentage. It's up to 50 or 60 million, I think, can be used towards the match on a comparable or connecting system. Yep.
So you are using TIFIA, or are you just thinking about it?
As I said just a minute ago, this originally was a private sector project, and the private sector project was this original 3 miles, 3.3, 3.4 miles. There were some other folks that came in and wanted to expand it to the further distance and did the environmental work and everything on that. The private sector folks still feel that the first increment was the 3.3, 3.4 miles, and by having the federal legislation that would allow it to leverage future federal funds, if someone wants to go forward, there's that opportunity.
thank Heather Carmona, Mayor O'Reilly, and Mohammed Al-Jarabi.